The frozen earth of Belgium cracked beneath Lieutenant Colonel Johann Piper's jackboots as he surveyed the dense Ardennes forest on the morning of December 15, 1944. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains, muffling the sounds of tanks and half-tracks assembling in the pre-dawn darkness. Piper, commander of Kampftruppe, Piper of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, knew that tomorrow would either resurrect the Third Reich's fortunes or seal its doom forever. Herr Obersturmbannführer whispered his aide. The weather forecast confirms heavy fog and snow for the morning attack. Perfect conditions. Piper nodded grimly. Operation Watch on the Rhine. Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and recapture the vital port of Antwerp represented Germany's final throw of the dice. 3 entire armies, over 200,000 men, were poised to smash through what German intelligence believed was a thinly held American sector. The plan was audacious. Punch through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and drive north to Antwerp, cutting off British and Canadian forces while forcing the Americans to negotiate a separate peace, miles away. In the warmth of a requisitioned farmhouse near Bustone, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division pored over intelligence reports with growing unease. The reports spoke of unusual German radio traffic, increased locomotive movements behind enemy lines, and strange sounds in the night, the grinding of tank treads and the rumble of truck engines. Yet higher command dismissed these warnings as routine German defensive preparations. According to historical accounts documented in the Battle of the Bulge by Hugh Cole, American forces in the Ardennes were spread dangerously thin, with green divisions holding sectors meant for veteran troops. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh from training in England, had only recently taken positions in what was considered a quiet sector of the front, in the village of Lanzerath. Staff Sergeant Lyle Boak Jr. of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, 99th Infantry Division, huddled with his 18 men in their frozen foxholes. At 20 years old, Boak was responsible for observing German movements along a crucial road junction. His men, mostly teenagers, themselves had spent weeks in these positions, watching the seemingly empty German lines across the snow-covered fields. "Think they'll try something for Christmas, Sarge?" asked Private First Class James Fort. His breath visible in the Arctic air, Boak studied the German positions through his binoculars. Something felt different today. The usual patterns of enemy activity had changed subtly over the past week, small signs that individually meant nothing, but collectively suggested preparation for something big. As night fell on December 15th, the stage was set for what would become the largest battle fought by American forces during World War II. In the German assembly areas, over 1,000 tanks and assault guns prepared to advance. Panther and Tiger tanks, their steel hulls, camouflaged with winter whitewash, idled quietly while their crews performed final equipment checks. Artillery pieces over 1,000 guns were pre-registered on American positions, ready to unleash the heaviest bombardment the Western Front had seen since D-Day. The Americans, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the approaching storm. The 422nd, 423rd, and 424th Infantry Regiments of the 106th Division held a 27-mile front that should have been defended by a full corps. Their positions, hastily prepared and inadequately supplied, would soon face the full fury of the German offensive. As midnight approached, bringing December 16th, both sides settled into an uneasy quiet. The Americans performed routine patrols and maintained their watch while across no man's land, German assault troops blackened their faces and checked their weapons one final time. The fate of the war in Europe would be decided in the coming hours, in the frozen forests and snow-covered hills of the Ardennes, where winter had already claimed more casualties than enemy bullets. The deadly turn was about to begin at 5:30. In the morning, on December 16th, 1944, the Western Front exploded. Over 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 85-mile front, from Monchaux in the north to Echternach in the south. The concentrated barrage shattered the pre-dawn silence and announced Hitler's final desperate offensive to a stunned American Eighth Corps. Staff Sergeant Lyle Boak and his reconnaissance platoon were among the first to witness the German assault. The thunderous artillery bombardment lasted 90 minutes, raining destruction on American positions throughout the Ardennes. When the guns finally fell silent, the eerie quiet was broken by a new sound, the grinding roar of hundreds of tanks, and the tramp of thousands of boots advancing through the snow. "Jesus Christ," whispered Private Fort as searchlights suddenly blazed to life across the German lines, their beams cutting through the morning fog to illuminate advancing columns of Panzer Grenadiers. The lights, originally intended for night bombing raids over Britain, now served to guide German infantry through the difficult terrain of the Ardennes forest. Boak grabbed his field telephone and cranked the handle frantically. "This is Op. 2, he shouted into the receiver. "We've got Krauts coming at us in battalion strength. Request immediate artillery support." But the telephone lines, severed by the preliminary bombardment, remained dead, 20 miles south, in the village of Clairvaux. Lieutenant Colonel Hurley Fuller of the 110th Infantry Regiment, 28th Infantry Division watched in horror as German tanks emerged from the morning mist like steel phantoms. The lead Panzer IV tank crashed through the village's outer defenses, its main guns swiveling toward the American positions. Fuller's undermanned regiment, spread across a front meant for a full division, do little more than delay the German advance, as documented in Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers. The initial German assault achieved complete tactical surprise. American units found themselves cut off, surrounded, and fighting desperately against overwhelming odds. Communication networks collapsed under the artillery barrage, leaving isolated garrisons to fight blind battles against an enemy whose strength and intentions remained unknown. In the German command post, General Hasso von Manteuffel of the 5th Panzer Army studied situation reports with growing satisfaction. His forces were achieving their initial objectives ahead of schedule. The 47th Panzer Corps had punched through American lines near Dasburg, while the 58th Panzer Corps advanced rapidly toward Huffelise. The Americans appeared stunned by the ferocity and scale of the German offensive. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Johann Piper's Kampfrupp pressed forward along the northern route toward the Meuse River bridges. Piper's column, consisting of tanks, self-propelled guns, and mechanized infantry, represented the spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army's advance. His mission was clear: reach the Meuse River crossings within 48 hours and establish bridgeheads for the main German forces following behind at his headquarters in Spa. Belgium General Courtney Hodges, of the American First Army initially, dismissed reports of German attacks as limited spoiling operations. The concept of a major German offensive seemed impossible given intelligence estimates of enemy capabilities. However, as reports continued to flood in from across the front, the true scale of the German operation began to emerge. "Sir," reported Colonel Benjamin Dixon, First Army's intelligence officer, "we're receiving reports of German attacks from Moncho to Echternach. Initial estimates suggest at least 6 divisions involved, possibly more." Hodges frowned as he studied the situation map. Red arrows indicating German advances were appearing across the entire Ardennes sector. This was no limited attack. It was a full-scale offensive designed to split American forces and disrupt Allied plans for ending the war. Back at Lanzarote, Sergeant Boak's platoon found itself directly in the path of the 327th Volksgrenadier Regiment. Despite being outnumbered 50-1, Boak's 18 men fought with desperate courage from their frozen foxholes. Using carefully coordinated rifle fire and pre-positioned mines, they held up the entire German regiment for nearly 12 hours, disrupting the timetable for the northern prong of the German attack. S. December 16th war. The true magnitude of Hitler's gamble became apparent. 3 German armies, the 6th and 5th Panzer Armies, plus the 7th Army, were committed to an operation that would either revive German fortunes or exhaust the Reich's final reserves. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and for the Americans, caught in its path, the war had indeed taken a deadly turn. The longest day of fighting was just beginning. By noon, on December 16th, 1944, chaos reigned across the American front lines in the Ardennes. Radio networks crackled with desperate calls for reinforcements, artillery support, and evacuation routes, as German spearheads punched through defensive positions that had seemed secure just hours earlier. The fog of war had descended with a vengeance, leaving American commanders struggling to understand the scope and direction of the German offensive. At the headquarters of the 106th Infantry Division in St. Vith, Major General Alan Jones faced an impossible situation. His division, Green troops who had arrived in Europe only days earlier, was being systematically destroyed by veteran German panzer divisions. Reports flooded in of entire battalions cut off, regimental command posts overrun, supply lines severed by fast-moving German armor. "Sir, we've lost contact with the 422nd and 423rd Infantry," reported his operations officer, his voice strained with exhaustion. Last reports indicated they were surrounded near Schnee Eifel. Jones stared at the situation map, watching as red pins marking German positions multiplied across his sector. Nearly 8,000 men of his division were trapped in what was rapidly becoming known as the Schnee Eifel Pocket. These soldiers, many of whom had never seen combat, now faced the full fury of German veterans fighting for their homeland survival. 15 miles southeast, the ancient town of Echternach had become a battleground, as units of the German 212th Volksgrenadier Division attempted to cross the Sauer River. Captain Paul Dupuy of the 4th Infantry Division's 12th Infantry Regiment found his company fighting house-to-house battles against German paratroopers who had infiltrated the town during the night, according to war correspondent Martha Gellhorn's reports from the battle. American soldiers displayed remarkable courage. Despite being caught completely off guard by the German offensive, individual acts of heroism became commonplace as small units fought desperate delaying actions against overwhelming odds. In the village of Hosingen, Lieutenant First Class John Granville and 42 men of Company K, 110th Infantry Regiment had barricaded themselves in the local inn, surrounded by elements of the German 277th Volksgrenadier Division. They fought room by room as German soldiers pressed their attack. Granville's radio operator managed to maintain contact with regimental headquarters long enough to call in artillery strikes on their own position. "This is King Company," crackled the radio transmission. "We're taking heavy casualties but still holding. Estimate enemy strength at battalion level. Request immediate reinforcement or permission to withdraw." But no reinforcements were available. The German offensive had shattered American defensive positions across a front stretching from the Elsenborn Ridge to the Luxembourg border. Reserve units were being rushed forward, but it would take time for them to reach the battle area and organize effective counterattacks. Lieutenant Colonel Johann Piper's Kampftruppe had advanced nearly 20 miles since dawn, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Near the village of Hansfeld, Piper's tanks overran a convoy of American trucks carrying sleeping soldiers from the 99th Infantry Division. The surprise was complete. Many Americans were captured while still in their sleeping bags. Studied his map as his column refueled using captured American gasoline. His advance was proceeding faster than planned, but ammunition and fuel were becoming concerns. The narrow Belgian roads, clogged with refugees and military traffic, made resupply difficult. Still, the Meuse River bridges were within reach if his momentum could be maintained. As evening approached on December 16th, American resistance began to stiffen in key locations. At the crossroads town of St. Vith, Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division arrived just in time to reinforce the beleaguered 106th Infantry Division. Tank destroyers and Sherman tanks took defensive positions around the town, preparing for the inevitable German assault. Similarly, at Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was being rushed from reserve positions to defend the crucial road junction. General McAuliffe's paratroopers, veterans of Normandy and Operation Market Garden, began arriving by truck convoy as German forces approached from multiple directions. The first day of the Battle of the Bulge had cost the Americans dearly. Entire regiments had been destroyed or scattered, thousands of soldiers were missing or captured, and German forces had advanced up to 15 miles in some sectors. Yet American resistance, though initially surprised and overwhelmed, was beginning to coalesce around key defensive positions. As December 16th drew to a close, Both sides prepared for the battles to come. The Germans had achieved tactical surprise and initial success, but their timetable was already slipping. The Americans, shocked by the ferocity of the German offensive, were beginning to understand that this was no limited attack, but a desperate gamble that could determine the outcome of the war in Europe. The deadly turn in the Ardennes was gathering momentum. Dawn on December 17, 1944, brought no respite to the American forces reeling from Germany's surprise offensive. As fog lifted from the snow-covered Ardennes forests, the true scope of the German breakthrough became terrifyingly clear. Entire divisions had been shattered, communication lines severed, and supply routes cut as three German armies pressed their advantage deep into American-held territory. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe arrived in Bastogne at 11 o'clock that morning, his jeep convoy having navigated roads clogged with retreating American units and Belgian refugees fleeing. The advancing Germans. The town, situated at the intersection of 7 major roads, represented the key to controlling movement throughout the southern Ardennes. McAuliffe's 101st Airborne Division hastily loaded onto trucks and rushed from reserve. Positions near Reims would have to hold Bastogne at all costs. General German reconnaissance units are already probing our outer defenses, reported Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. Intelligence estimates suggest we're facing elements of at least 3 German divisions converging on the town. McAuliffe studied the situation map grimly. His division, while veteran, was scattered across multiple defensive positions and lacked adequate ammunition, medical supplies, and winter equipment. The paratroopers had deployed so rapidly that many companies carried only basic combat loads and were wearing standard field uniforms rather than winter gear suited for sub-zero temperatures. 20 miles north, Lieutenant Colonel Johann Peiper's Kampfrupp continued its relentless advance toward the Meuse River bridges. Near the village of Malmedy, Peiper's column encountered Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The American convoy, consisting of 30 vehicles carrying over 100 men, was traveling south to support infantry units when it ran directly into Peiper's advancing tanks. The engagement lasted only minutes. Outgunned and surprised, the Americans surrendered quickly to avoid unnecessary casualties. What happened next would become one of the war's most notorious atrocities. On Peiper's orders, the American prisoners were herded into a nearby field where SS troops opened fire with machine guns and small arms, killing 84 unarmed soldiers in what became known as the Malmedy Massacre, as reported by war correspondent William Stringer of Reuters. Of the massacre spread rapidly through American units, hardening resolve and eliminating any thought of easy surrender to German forces. The killing of prisoners violated all conventions of warfare and demonstrated the desperate brutality that characterized Germany's final offensive. In the village of La Glise, Peiper's advance finally stalled against determined American resistance. Major Hal McCown's 2nd Battalion, 119th Infantry Regiment, had established defensive positions among the stone buildings and was supported by tank destroyers and artillery. Despite repeated German attacks, McCown's men held their ground, forcing Peiper to deploy his entire Kampfrupp in costly frontal assaults. Meanwhile, at St. Vith, the American defenders faced mounting pressure as German forces tightened their encirclement. General Robert Hasbrook's 7th Armored Division, reinforced by remnants of the 106th Infantry Division, fought desperately to maintain control of the crucial road junction. German artillery pounded the town continuously while panzer units probed for weak points in the American defensive perimeter. Back in Bastogne, the situation deteriorated rapidly as German forces completed their encirclement of the town. By December 20th, all road connections to American rear areas had been severed, leaving McAuliffe's 10,000 men completely surrounded. Supply drops by parachute became the only means of receiving ammunition, medical supplies, and food. "Sir, German representatives are approaching under a white flag," reported a sentry to Colonel Harper on the morning of December 22nd. The German emissaries carried an ultimatum from General Heinrich von Leutwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps. demanding immediate surrender of Bastogne to avoid total annihilation of the American garrison. McAuliffe's response became legendary. After reading the German ultimatum, he reportedly exclaimed, "Nuts," and instructed his staff to prepare a formal written reply using the same word. The terse rejection was delivered to the German representatives, who required translation to understand the American idiom's meaning. The siege of Bastogne had begun in earnest. German artillery and rocket fire pounded the town continuously, while infantry and tank attacks probed the American defensive perimeter. The paratroopers, supported by elements of Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, fought from foxholes carved in frozen ground, their ammunition carefully rationed and their medical supplies dwindling. As December 22nd drew to a close, the fate of Bastogne hung in the balance. The town's defenders had become symbols of American determination, but their situation was desperate. Relief columns were fighting to break through German lines, but success was far from certain. The deadly turn in the Ardennes had reached its most critical moment, with the outcome of Hitler's gamble depending largely on whether Bastogne could hold out against overwhelming odds. December 23rd, 1944, dawned clear and bitterly cold across the Ardennes battlefield. For the first time since the German offensive began, Allied aircraft could take to the skies as the weather cleared, revealing the true extent of the German penetration into American lines. The bulge in Allied positions stretched nearly 60 miles wide and 30 miles deep, creating a dangerous salient that threatened to split Allied forces and potentially change the course of the war. In Bastogne, the besieged paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division greeted the clear skies with desperate relief. Within hours, transport aircraft began dropping supplies to the surrounded garrison while fighter bombers attacked German positions around the town's perimeter. The psychological effect was enormous. McAuliffe's men realized they had not been abandoned and that relief efforts were underway. Staff Sergeant Morris Markowitz of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment crouched in his frozen foxhole on Bastogne's eastern perimeter, watching German infantry advance across snow-covered fields. His company had been reduced to half strength during 6 days of continuous fighting, but morale remained surprisingly high despite the desperate circumstances. "Here they come again," whispered Private David Webster, adjusting his rifle sight. The Germans were attacking in company strength, supported by 2 Panzer IV tanks that had somehow survived the morning's air attacks. Markowitz could see the distinctive gray-green uniforms of Panzer Grenadiers as they moved through the tree line, their breath visible in the Arctic air. The engagement that followed epitomized the brutal infantry fighting that characterized the Battle of the Bulge. American paratroopers, armed primarily with rifles and bazookas, fought German mechanized infantry, equipped with automatic weapons and supported by armor. The battle raged for 3 hours before the German attack was repulsed, leaving dozens of bodies scattered across the blood-stained snow. 30 miles northwest, the situation at St. Vith had become untenable. General Hasbrouck's defenders had held the town for 6 days against overwhelming German pressure. But ammunition was nearly exhausted, and casualties had reached 50% in some units. Field Marshal Montgomery, now commanding American forces in the northern sector of the Bulge, finally authorized withdrawal to more defensible positions. The evacuation of St. Vith began during the night of December 23rd under cover of artillery smoke. American engineers destroyed bridges, supply dumps, communication facilities, while rearguard units fought delaying actions against pursuing German forces. The withdrawal was conducted with remarkable discipline despite the desperate circumstances, preserving most of Hasbrouck's remaining combat strength. According to historian Hugh Cole's official army history, the defense of St. Vith had served a crucial strategic purpose by delaying German timetables and forcing the commitment of additional enemy reserves. The 6-day battle had cost the Americans heavily, but it had disrupted German plans and provided time for Allied reserves to deploy. Lieutenant Colonel Johann Piper's Kampftruppe, meanwhile, found itself trapped in the village of La Glaise, surrounded by American forces and running critically low on fuel and ammunition. Piper's rapid advance had outrun his supply lines, and attempts to resupply by air had failed due to adverse weather conditions. His once mighty armored column now consisted of fewer than 30 operational tanks and 800 men. Major Hal McCown, captured during fighting around Stewmont, found himself held prisoner in Piper's command post. The American officer observed the German situation with professional interest, noting the deteriorating morale and supply shortages that plagued Piper's forces. German soldiers, many of them teenagers, conscripted in the war's final months, showed signs of exhaustion and hopelessness despite their recent victories. "Your situation is hopeless, Herr Major," Piper told McCown during one of their conversations. "My men have fought magnificently, but we cannot hold out much longer without reinforcement." The SS colonel's admission revealed the desperate nature of Germany's final gamble. Even successful units found themselves isolated and vulnerable deep in enemy territory. As Christmas Eve approached, American forces launched their first major counterattacks against the German salient. General George Patton's Third Army, redeployed from positions in Lorraine with remarkable speed, began attacking northward toward Bastogne. The 4th Armored Division spearheaded Patton's advance, fighting through German defensive positions. In bitter winter conditions, tank battles raged across snow-covered fields as American Shermans engaged German Panthers and Tigers in running fights. The superior armor and guns of German tanks were offset by American numerical superiority and air support. Villages changed hands multiple times as both sides committed their reserves in desperate attempts to achieve decisive results. In Bastogne itself, the German bombardment intensified as enemy commanders recognized that time was running out. Heavy artillery and rocket fire pounded the town continuously while German infantry launched repeated attacks against the shrinking American perimeter. The paratroopers held grimly to their positions, knowing that relief was approaching, but uncertain whether it would arrive in time. The blood-soaked snow of the Ardennes had become a testament to the courage and sacrifice of soldiers on both sides. The Battle of the Bulge had reached its climax, with the outcome still hanging in the balance as Christmas 1944 approached. Christmas Eve 1944 brought no peace to the embattled Ardennes. Instead, it marked the climax of Hitler's desperate gamble as German forces made their final attempts to reach the Meuse River while American units fought desperately to contain the Bulge and relieve the surrounded garrison at Bastogne. The irony was not lost on soldiers of both sides that they were killing each other during Christianity's most sacred season, in the besieged town of Bastogne. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's paratroopers prepared for what many believed would be their final battle. German artillery had intensified throughout December 24th, and intelligence reports indicated that fresh enemy divisions were moving into position for a coordinated assault. The American perimeter had shrunk to barely 3 miles in diameter, with German positions visible from the town center. Chaplain Francis Sampson of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment moved among the wounded in Bastogne's makeshift aid stations, providing comfort to dying soldiers in cellars and damaged buildings throughout the town. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and morphine had run out days earlier. Yet the wounded men maintained remarkable morale, many insisting they would return to their foxholes as soon as possible. "Padre, you think we'll make it?" asked Sergeant James Hendricks, wounded during the previous day's fighting. His leg had been shattered by German artillery, but he refused evacuation attempts, knowing that no safe passage existed. "Son, if faith and courage can see us through, then we'll celebrate New Year in our own lines," Sampson replied, though privately he wondered whether relief would arrive before. German forces overwhelmed the shrinking perimeter, 20 miles south. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, led the spearhead of General Patton's relief effort. Abrams' Sherman tanks advanced through knee-deep snow, fighting German defensive positions that had been hastily established across every road leading to Bastogne. The advance had covered only 8 miles in 3 days of continuous fighting, but Abrams remained determined to break through before the surrounded garrison was annihilated. "Contact front," shouted Sergeant Curtis Houston as his tank's main gun swiveled toward a camouflaged German anti-tank position. The engagement lasted only seconds, but it represented the 100th such encounter since Patton's counteroffensive began. Every village, crossroads, and hill had become a battlefield as German forces fought desperately to maintain their encirclement of Bastogne. As documented in Cornelius, Ryan's A Bridge Too Far, American tank crews displayed extraordinary courage. During the relief effort, often advancing along narrow roads where single German anti-tank guns could destroy entire columns, the fighting was characterized by close-range engagements where individual tank commanders made split-second decisions that determined the fate of their crews and the success of the mission. Meanwhile, at La Glaise, Lieutenant Colonel Johann Piper faced an impossible situation. His Kampfruppe, once the spearhead of German hopes for reaching Antwerp, was now trapped and facing annihilation. American forces had tightened their encirclement, and German attempts to resupply or reinforce Piper's position had failed completely. Fuel stocks were exhausted, ammunition was nearly gone, and many of his men were wounded or suffering from frostbite. Herr Obersturmbannführer, we must attempt to break out tonight, urged SS Hauptsturmführer Werner Sternbeck, Piper's operations officer. American positions appear weakest to the southeast, near Trois Ponts. Piper studied his situation map one final time. His once mighty armored column had been reduced to fewer than 800 men and no operational tanks. The breakout attempt would have to be conducted on foot, abandoning all heavy equipment and leaving the wounded behind. It was a bitter acknowledgement that Germany's last offensive had failed. On Christmas morning, 1944, both sides observed a brief, unofficial truce as soldiers on both sides attended religious services. In Bastogne, Chaplain Sampson conducted Mass in a damaged church, while German shells whistled overhead. The paratroopers sang Christmas carols in voices hoarse from shouting orders and breathing cordite smoke, their faces blackened by battle, and their uniforms torn by shrapnel. Similar scenes occurred throughout the battle zone as soldiers found brief respite from killing to remember the reason for the season. German and American medics worked side by side to treat wounded from both armies, while temporary ceasefires were arranged to evacuate casualties and collect the dead from frozen battlefields. The truce ended at noon, when German forces launched their most determined assault yet against Bastogne's perimeter. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, supported by the heaviest artillery bombardment of the siege. German infantry, many wearing white camouflage smocks, advanced through the snow, while panzer tanks provided close support. The battle raged for 6 hours as McAuliffe's paratroopers fought desperately to maintain their defensive positions. I of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment was overrun and destroyed, creating a dangerous gap in the American lines. Only a desperate counterattack by reserve elements prevented German forces from breaking into Bastogne itself. As Christmas Day drew to a close, both sides were exhausted by 8 days of continuous fighting. The German offensive had achieved initial surprise and spectacular tactical success, but strategic objectives remained elusive. American resistance had stiffened considerably, and Allied reserves were arriving in increasing numbers. The Battle of the Bulge was approaching its turning point, though few participants yet realized that Germany's last great gamble was already doomed to failure. December 26, 1944, dawned with the destiny of Hitler's final offensive. Hanging by the thinnest of threads, the German penetration into Allied lines had reached its maximum extent, but fuel shortages, mounting casualties, and strengthening American resistance were turning the tide inexorably against the Third Reich's last desperate gamble. Across the snow-covered Ardennes, both armies prepared for battles that would determine whether Germany could snatch victory from the jaws of defeat or face an inevitable collapse. At precisely 4:45 in the afternoon, the distinctive rumble of Sherman tank engines echoed through the streets of Bastogne as Lieutenant Colonel Creighton, Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion finally broke through German encirclement. The lead tank, commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, crashed through German defensive positions on the Arlennes Road and made contact with forward elements of the 526th Armored Infantry Battalion defending the town's southern perimeter. "Come on out! This is the 4th Armored," shouted Boggess through his tank's intercom as paratroopers emerged from their foxholes to surround the breakthrough force. The siege of Bastogne which had lasted 6 days and become a symbol of American determination, was finally broken. Within hours, supply convoys were moving into the town, bringing desperately needed ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the defender of Bastogne whose nuts, response to German surrender demands, had become legendary, greeted the relief column with characteristic understatement. "It's good to see you," he told Abrams, though. His exhausted expression revealed the strain of commanding a surrounded garrison under impossible conditions. The relief of Bastogne marked the beginning of the end for German hopes in the Ardennes. General George Patton's Third Army had accomplished what many considered impossible, redeploying 3 divisions over 100 miles in severe winter conditions and launching a successful counteroffensive within 72 hours. The achievement demonstrated American logistical capabilities and tactical flexibility that German commanders had consistently underestimated. 40 miles northwest, Lieutenant Colonel Johann Piper was leading the remnants of his once mighty Kampfgruppe in a desperate attempt to escape American encirclement. On the night of December 24th, Piper had abandoned all his tanks and heavy equipment at La Gleize, leading 800 men on foot through American positions toward German lines. The breakout succeeded due to American confusion and the SS troops' superior night fighting skills, but Piper's force was no longer a coherent military unit. "We must reach one before dawn," Piper whispered to his officers as the column stumbled through deep snow and dense forest. German casualties were mounting from frostbite and exhaustion, while American patrols were actively hunting the escaping SS troops. Of the 5,000 men who had begun the offensive with Piper's Kampfgruppe, fewer than 700 would eventually reach German lines, according to Stephen Ambrose's historical analysis. Piper's breakout marked the effective end of the 6th Panzer Army's offensive capability. The unit that had been Germany's primary hope for reaching the Meuse River bridges was now scattered and ineffective, its equipment abandoned and its personnel exhausted. The failure of Kampfgruppe Piper symbolized the broader failure of Operation Watch on the Rhine. By December 31st, 1944, American forces had eliminated the German salient and restored the original front lines. The 1st and 3rd Armies, attacking from north and south respectively, compressed the German bulge in a series of coordinated offensives that demonstrated improved Allied cooperation and tactical competence. German resistance remained fierce, but fuel shortages and overwhelming Allied air superiority made organized withdrawal inevitable. The final act of the Battle of the Bulge occurred on January 25, 1945, when American forces recaptured the town of St. Vith. The battle that had begun with German hopes of splitting Allied forces and negotiating a favorable peace had instead consumed Germany's final strategic reserves, hastened the Third Reich's collapse. The human cost of Hitler's gamble was staggering. American casualties totaled nearly 90,000 men, including 19,000 killed in action. German losses exceeded 100,000 casualties, including the destruction of entire Panzer and Volksgrenadier divisions that could never be replaced. The Wehrmacht had gambled everything on one final offensive and lost decisively. For the soldiers who fought in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge represented both the ultimate test of courage and the turning point that ensured Allied victory in Europe. Staff Sergeant Lyle Boak, whose reconnaissance platoon had delayed German attacks on the first day, would receive the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions. Major Hal McCown, captured by Piper's forces, would testify at post-war trials about German war crimes. The Battle of the Bulge had indeed marked a deadly turn in the war, but not the one Hitler had envisioned. Instead of reviving German fortunes, the offensive had ensured that Nazi Germany would face unconditional surrender within 4 months. The courage of American soldiers fighting in impossible conditions, exemplified by the defenders of Bastogne and countless other small unit actions, had turned Hitler's last gamble into his final defeat. As spring came to the Ardennes in 1945, the forests that had witnessed such desperate fighting began to show signs of new life. The scars of battle would remain for decades, but the war in Europe was drawing to its inevitable conclusion. The legacy of the Ardennes offensive would endure long after the guns fell silent. For Germany, the Battle of the Bulge represented the final squandering of reserves that might have prolonged resistance for months. Hitler's decision to commit his last mechanized forces to an impossible offensive rather than defending the Rhine River or other natural barriers hastened the Third Reich's collapse and ensured that the European war would end by May 1940-5. The United States Army. The battle demonstrated both the dangers of complacency and the resilience of American fighting men when faced with seemingly impossible odds. The initial German success highlighted intelligence failures and the risks of thinly held defensive lines. But the ultimate American victory showcased the nation's industrial might, logistical capabilities, and the courage of individual soldiers fighting for their lives and their cause. The small unit actions that characterized the Battle of the Bulge reconnaissance platoon at Lanzerath, the defenders of Bastogne, the tank crews of the 4th Armored Division became part of American military legend. These soldiers, many of them teenagers fighting their first battle, had faced veteran German troops in winter conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. Their victory was not achieved through superior equipment or overwhelming numbers, but through determination, improvisation, and an unwillingness to surrender, even when surrounded and outnumbered. The Ardennes offensive of December 1944 had indeed marked a deadly turn in World War II, but the turn had led not to German resurrection, but to final Allied victory. In the frozen forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, the last great battle of the Western Front had been fought and won, ensuring that the world would be free from Nazi tyranny and that democracy would prevail over fascism. The war took its deadly turn in the Ardennes, but it turned toward justice, freedom, and the preservation of human dignity. The soldiers who fought there, both living and dead, had written the final chapter of Hitler's 1,000-year Reich in blood and snow, ensuring that it would last only 12 years and end in complete and unconditional defeat.